not food and beverages, but
Oh,
they're
yeah,
gonna take
if
to
you
go,
want to.
if you want to take it
Okay.
and go. Thanks.
Okay. All right. Apologies to those of you behind me, but I'm standing in front of the camera so the camera can see me, even though my back is to you. So please don't be offended. I want to thank the library for hosting us, giving us both the space and some support, as well as some food and beverages, which you're welcome to take on your way out. COVID protocols being what they are, everything's wrapped and secure. A reminder for those of you in person that if you have questions at the end of her talk, you can come up more towards the front of the room. This box will pick you up, but not from the back. You have to come towards the front. Also, people can submit questions either through the Q&A chat feature on the webinar. Okay. As a reminder to everybody, also this is being recorded and live broadcast. So, okay. This particular talk is sponsored by the Department of Modern Languages, Literatures, and Cultures, the program in Borders and Migrations, the library, and in particular the Library Archives speaker series, which we were able to join forces for this particular talk, and the Vice President for Academic Affairs, and my lovely SEEP student here, Sarah Lynch, who's my tech support at the moment. I also want to thank the Department of Political Science and the Program in International Relations, and Paola Fajardo-Hayward, who also is supporting this. And of course, my colleague, Amy Larson in the PA program. And I'm going to introduce Montserrat in just a second, but I want to note the international nature of all of this because I've got to know Montserrat through my husband, Davide Salvo, who's Italian, who knew Amy Shirakawa, who lives in Osaka, who knows Montserrat, who's in Geneva and Barcelona. So we've spanned the globe to get all of this together. So Montserrat Canela Garayoa is an archivist based in Geneva, although at the moment she's in Barcelona, I found out last night. She's also a Catalan writer who works in the UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency. The UNHCR ensures that everybody has the right to seek asylum and find safe refuge, having fled violence, persecution, war, or disaster at home. And I would just remind us all of the letter we got from our president yesterday regarding Afghan refugees being resettled here in Buffalo and residing here on a temporary basis at Canisius. Since 1959, the UNHCR has faced multiple crises on multiple continents and provided vital assistance to refugees, asylum seekers, internally displaced stateless people, and returnees. Montserrat's work as the chief of the Records and Archives section is to preserve institutional memory and the memory of those who UNHCR supported since it was created until today and into the future. Before she moved to Geneva, Montserrat worked as an archivist in Barcelona, and she is also the author of 7 fiction books and children's books in Catalan. And if they've been translated into English, perhaps we can get them here in our library as well. So with that, I will let Montserrat do her talk.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. And I hope you will understand me because I have this awful idea to speak very, very fast. So I hope I will slow down. And if anything, I'm speaking too fast, please tell me and I will stop. I have prepared a presentation, so you can not only see me online, but you can see some images that will support what I'm saying. So let me share my screen with all of you. And I hope it will work. Share the screen. And okay, so here I am. So as I said, and as thank you very much for the presentation, what I wanted to have today is the t-shirt of your college, but I forgot it in Geneva. thanks to COVID, we are able to work in different parts of the world until I think the end of the year. So I took the advantage to work a week from my home, so I could visit my familiars. And I forgot my t-shirt, which is a nice, very nice blue, and I cannot have it with me. But imagine I'm dressed with your t-shirt. So what I want to talk to you about is about archives. And many people, I know that there's a library and there's an archive, so they probably will not think about archives like this. But many people I know, what I insist on keeping, that I'm an archivist, the first idea that they come to their mind, it's an obscure, mysterious place full of information and boxes. And nobody knows what it's there. And I have colleagues talking about the dungeons in the archives, or the treasures in the archives, or could you dig up something for us in the archives? So I think they imagine that we're going with a place like this and where we find things. But what I'm always telling to everybody and to you is that archives are not about papers. Archives are not about information. In fact, archives are about people. And that's what they are so interesting. And that's what I'm so engaged with the work I do. So I will explain you how I just got this idea to see archives not as papers I need to preserve, not as documents I need to preserve, but about people. And I will go back to when I start as a young graduate from a history department, and I got my first job into the archives of a town, 5,000 people, but a very long history. I had in my hands 600 years of history, so starting in the 12th century and at that time ending in the 20th century. The whole life of this community was there. I had the archives of the municipality, I had the archives of the church, I had the archives of the notaries. And with this, I had the whole story of this town in my hands, and I was curating it. And also didn't have much experience working in archives, because a historian and archivist is not exactly the same. I also was alone. I was the only one. And I think that the colleague that was closest to me my boss was 100 kilometers away. So I had a very special mentor, and it was the diaries of the first archivist who in this town, who was in the beginning of the 20th century. He kept a diary explaining how he created the archives, why they were so important, and all the things he was explaining. The diary started to become very dramatic when he reached 1936, which when it's the Spanish Civil War. So between 1936 and 1939 was civil war in Spain, but also in what it's Catalonia was the revolution. So it was not only the war, it was also people changing the way to work. And there was a kind of strong reaction against power, and archives were often seen as the power. And many of the archives were destroyed, but not this one. And I was wondering why these archives have been so well protected, why nothing has happened, why the archivist was able to move around and save other archives and save other things. And what I discovered through these diaries is that he always had this idea that the archives didn't belong to him, didn't belong to researchers, they belonged to the community. So as early as the 20s and the 30s, this archivist has worked a lot with the community, had a lot of bringing them inside this history, explaining them what was there, what was the past and the present. And this why to work, preserve the archives. And as for me, as the young archivist, that was a lesson I kept with me. And I always thought, what I'm doing is I'm curating something that doesn't belong to me. It doesn't belong even to the owner of these archives. It belongs to the people who create them, and belongs to their descendants and the people who work with them. So for me, this is not the expression of an archive. It is the people who are there, and that's what is important. So what happens when you move to an international organization that, as you just hear, is working with refugees, and it's working in a humanitarian thing. So the objective of UNHCR is not a university, so it's not keeping archives because they are interesting for researchers. It is not a memory institution like the National Archives, or municipality archives. I was working in my first archives. It is to save lives. So why UNHCR will invest in archives? And this is the question that my boss, my director, put to me in 2012. I went 2012 to see him. There was the Syrian crisis, and I was really preoccupied with how we're going to keep this information. I knew that information about emergencies is the information that it's usually asked for, and it's usually what we need to find over and over and over. I think that UNHCR was created 70 years ago, so we had been through a lot of emergencies in our existence. So I was thinking, in the 90s, the biggest emergency UNHCR was involved with was the Yugoslavia, the Balkans crisis, 5 years of war in Yugoslavia, where UNHCR was in all parts of this conflict. And when the crisis ended in 1995, the year after, all the files of this crisis were put in trucks and sent to the archives. And we had a kilometer of files in a room on paper that were explaining the whole role of UNHCR in this crisis. But in 2012, what was the problem? The problem was that the archives of the information is no longer paper, the information is digital. And I was wondering how we're going to capture this. So I wanted my boss to support me with a budget to have a project that we could go to Syria in an emergency and collect the information as it was created. Because I knew, and my colleagues knew, that if we wait 5 years, it will disappear. It will not be there. So we wanted to go and work. So that's what my director did. He took this food bar, the Plumpy Nuts bar, and he showed it to me. And he said, this bar saves people. This part it's given to children that have malnutrition, that they are dying because they didn't eat for days. And with a couple of these bars, you save their life. Why should give money to the archives? Why should give? Because he was asking for $1 million. Why should give you all this money instead of expending it with food for their refugees? Well, the answer to this question is what I'm trying to tell you during this presentation. Why we should spend money not only on food for refugees, not only on Plumpy Nuts bars to save their life, but we also should keep the history and their files and their stories. So to explain this and to see that there is more than papers in the archives, I'm going to move. I just am going to think about the work of UNHCR. So let's start. UNHCR works with refugees. So who are refugees? Refugees are people who had to cross a border and they are in another country, but they didn't cross the border because they wanted. They crossed the border because if they stay in the country they were in, their country, they have fear that they will lose their lives, or they will lose their freedom or their rights. So a refugee is somebody who crosses the border hoping that at the other side in another country will be protected. Refugee is not like a migrant who in theory has crossed because to look for a better world but can't go back. A refugee cannot go back. So you know how many millions of refugees they exist today in the world? The last count we had, we are talking about 26.4 million of refugees. 26.4 million of refugees. There is also not only refugees, we have also internally displaced people. So what is an internally displaced person? Internally displaced person is somebody who hasn't crossed an international border. So they are still in the country, But the difference between a refugee, the only difference is that their government is supposed still to keep care of them. Only that sometimes, like in Yugoslavia, the government who's supposed to keep care of you is the one who's creating the problem. And the one who's creating the problem had to move from one part of you where you usually live to move to another place because of fear of the same. So the only difference between a refugee and IDP is that the refugee is protected by international law, while an internally displaced person is protected by the national law. But in the terms of support of needs, they are the same. They have the same needs. That's what UNHCR was created to deal with refugees, but today it is dealing also with IDPs. And one of the reasons is, if I told you that there was 26.4 million refugees, there are 48 million internally displaced people, so twice the same quantity of people. And so they also need help. In many countries that have internally displaced people, they ask UNHCR for help. Sometimes it's the UN who mandates UNHCR to do it, but usually it's the country that asks for help to deal with their own internal problems. There is also another type, which we call the asylum seekers, and it's asylum seeker has crossed a border, but it is still not recognized as refugee. It may or may not be recognized, but they are still protected. So they are 4.1 million of asylum seekers. There are also the returnees, who are the people who has been able to return to the country, but there's nothing in their country to return to. So they need support to reestablish and to start a life in their countries. And so all these people, all these numbers, is the dimension of the work of UNHCR. And if you think about this millions, we're talking about 70 million, around more. And we have 17,000 UNHCR staff members to work with them. It's obviously, we are a big organization, a big international organization, but very small. Just imagine a country. It's a whole country which is scattered through the world with people in distress, and we are a small organization compared to the size. But one thing which is very important is also that refugees come from some place and they go to some place. So if you look at these stats that I'm putting here, you see the hosting countries and the source countries. You can see that what are the major countries that generate refugees and the countries that host refugees. And then, as you can see on the other side, the majority are people between 18 and 59 years old. Those are the biggest quantity. This is all types, refugees, IDPs, asylum seekers. That's the quantities we are working with. So the thing I would like you to call your attention is that we are not talking about migrants. We are talking about forcibly displaced people. So the population we talk with is all these people who cannot go back, and it is a difference with migrants. We are in a world that migrants and refugees are all mixed. They use the same routes to move from country and they're displaced. But when it goes to our work is not with migrants. It is work with refugees, which have a legal instrument around them to protect them. And here, but something is very important. I'm talking about numbers and numbers and numbers, but as we said here, numbers can numb you. You shouldn't let them. It's not about numbers. All these numbers, and this tweet, it's old. It's not from now, so you can see that the numbers have grown from when this tweet was done by UNHCR. We're talking about people. We're talking about stories. Talking about dreams, about journeys, about lives, about people who miss everything, who lost everything, who wants to go home and cannot go home, about tragedies, and about displaced, but also about hope of starting a new life in a new place if they are accepted to start there. Is this because numbers and papers and information, all this is very cold? That one of the things I do when in my archives that I have a new staff member who arrive, one of the things I always said is, you have to leave Geneva and you have to go to the field where we work. So UNHCR has a structure with 10% of the staff is in Geneva, in Switzerland, and the 90%, all the 90%, it's in around the world. So we're in 120 countries, and in some of them, like European countries or North American countries or Japan, they are just working in a very good conditions, but many of them, they are working really in the zones that there is war or there is displacement, where the refugees are. So when we are in Geneva, refugees are posters we see on our walls. But when we go to the field where our colleagues are, the majority of our colleagues are working, is when we see the real refugees. So it's not a poster, it's somebody who's knocking at your door, somebody who is asking for help, and that you many times don't have what they need or what they want. You have what you have, and you try to help the maximum you can. So I always ask them, you have to go on a mission, and you have to see how we work, and then you will understand how we work and what we do and why we do it. So this is the story of one of my colleagues. It's Patricia, and Patricia is a digital archivist. So she is a specialist in digital preservation, highly specialized, very good in her field. And when she came to UNHCR, she had been working for the University College of London, preserving digital programs, digital assets. And she had her ideas, her technical ideas. This is how you have to work. This is the perfect way if you want to protect a database, if you want to protect the information of emails. This is what you have to do, and there's a very strict, very clear way to do it, and you do it. But she came to UNHCR, and I think it was maybe a couple of months after, she went to Lebanon. At this moment, it was the Syria operation. By the way, I got the money from my boss, so we could go to Syria. And this is not Syria, this is Lebanon, one of the countries that has received more refugees almost that people live in the country. So it's a huge quantity of refugees for the size of the country. And what you see here, it is a registration center. When refugees cross a border, the first protection activity, the first way to protect them is to register them. When you register, you are recognized as some asylum seeker to start with. You are protected. Police cannot send you back. You can say, I am under the ail of UNHCR, under the country. So here it is the what she saw. That's her pictures of this, and I just am going to read you what she wrote about this this first mission to the field. She said, "Nothing prepared me for what I saw. I realized quickly the gap between what we need to do and what an operation needs. I realized I was no longer in the University of London. Keep your eyes on the information, not on the people," were the words of the registration officer for UNHCR in Tripoli, Lebanon. As a rather nervous but also enthusiastic recruit from University of London, nothing in my life had prepared me for what I saw. I followed the track in the wasteland where UNHCR had set up its center. The sunshades creeping up from the waste ground, a normalizing effect on an extreme situation. Sorry. The shades protect the people in the long queues for the first stage of registration to get a date for an interview, then wait 2 weeks, and then the next stage, another huge room. A sad, quiet, polite atmosphere prevails. People waiting and silent before they were seen by the Lebanese Department of Health, and then finally the interview rooms. Men sat with their families, begging their fists on tables in despair, crying. Women silently with their children. I overlay with this with the children's drawing, and I will show you what she's meaning. Drawings from the archives, so demonstrate how many refugees are children. Oh, but you see, it's refugee children drawings that we keep in the archives. They were done by refugee children in the 70s and the 80s, and some way they make their way to the archives. It is very, very rare to get this type of information in the archives, but this is one of the most shocking testimonies we keep, because all these are children. We have a couple of hundred of refugee children, and we have used them in exhibitions, and also to make the point that what we are doing is keeping the story and the visions of these children. So this is the type of work and the type of conditions we are working with. And these families are the ones who will use this bar, this food bar. So now I need to stop and go a little bit back to show you what UNHCR does in practice. What do we do? So UNHCR was created in 1950, 14 December 1950. We are just 70 years old at this moment. We were created by the UN Assembly, and with a mission to end up with the 1.5 million refugees from the Second World War that were still not accounted for. They had no place to go. Think that the Second World War, it created a kind of 20 million displaced people. And in 1950, when UNHCR was created, there were still 1.5 million, that there was no solution for them. So UNHCR was supposed to solve this solution and disappear. But just we didn't disappear. And as you can see, 70 years after, the quantity is not 1.5 million, but much more people. So what we do exactly? So the first thing we do is protection. And what does it mean protection? What do you protect them? We are not bodyguards. So what it means protection? So essentially protection is the international law that says if you are a refugee, if you are recognized or an asylum seeker, once you have crossed a border, you have a series of rights. And these rights are in the convention of the Geneva Convention that was set in 1951. And what you have the right is, the first one is you have the right to not to be returned to the place where you are a danger. This is the principle of non-refoulement, it's called. So you also have a series of rights. You have right to access education. You have right to access some type of means to live. You have the right to get to health, and you have the right to stay in the country you are. That's one of the fundamental rights. So that's the first thing. We have a department of international protection that ensures that countries sign the convention, they apply the convention, and they apply it to the refugees. So they are not refoulement, and they are not. As you can imagine, we have a lot of work because countries, they are not always keen to do this, as they see refugees as a problem. But that's the first fundamental thing. And protection starts always with a registration. The story you saw about Patricia is where protection starts, with a registration, and then there is the law that protects you. But what is the point of having legal protection if you don't have shelter, and you don't have food, or you don't have a school to go if you die, if you are starving? So the second big work is called the operations, and you have here shelter and health as two big examples of what protection, not protection, but assistance means. That means that you have to have some type of shelter. This could be a refugee camp at the beginning, or it could be a home and a house when you have been settled in a better way. In fact, UNHCR tries not to have refugee camps. This is a solution that we would like to keep it very small, but we have to, sometimes there's no other option. So refugees are on this. Health, again, it's one of the primary needs. Health, children, check that everybody's okay, check that they receive what they need. And here you add food and water, and sanitation, and work, and access to education, and all these things. Advocacy, it means two types of work. One, it's to have an advocacy to understand. That's what I'm doing today. That's advocacy. Today I'm talking about refugees. I'm talking to you about what is important and what they should be protected and what is refugee and what it means. That advocacy also means to find the funding for these operations, because UNHCR only receive voluntary donations. We live from donations, and they are from governments, or they are from private sector, or they are from individuals, but they are all donations. So advocacy is a very huge part of the work of UNHCR. So all the rest can be done. And of course, we don't work with generic refugees. We work by individuals, one by one. They are treated and they are protected individually, one by one, with all their needs. So if a refugee gets into prison, it's detained, UNHCR will try to take this person out from prison because it's a refugee. If it has a problem with the law, we'll try to see what is the problem. So individuals. Also, if there is a discrimination about LGBT or against women or against the ethnicity that this person is, just to make sure that each individual has all the rights protected. And if you take the 80 million almost, and you take the 17,000 UNHCR staff members, you will understand that we cannot do this alone. So how is the way we work? Is there is a global needs assessment around the world. It is, what do we need? And who is in the position to contribute to the refugees? It's not UNHCR only. UNHCR coordinates, but they are the governments, but they are the NGOs, they are private sector, they are other agencies, and all this together, all of us together, we all work and find solutions for refugees. So it's not UNHCR is not alone. It's only one of the actors, the international actor that has the mandate to coordinate all this, but not to do it alone. So a lot of work is not done directly by UNHCR, but through partners or in collaboration with other agencies. So I hope I still have you with me with all this talk, and I'm going to move to the two ways we work. So what you see here is today, this is a picture of today. Today, those are the emergency situations UNHCR works with. Yes. So UNHCR was with two modes, the emergency mode and the operational one. But it's how the emergencies work. Well, all of a sudden, there is war, there is a disaster, and a billion people cross the border. That you have an emergency situation. So what UNHCR does when there is an emergency is in 72 hours, it deploys colleagues who are in the roster, and they are deployed in the region where the refugees are crossing. The one I remember that I was involved with, it was during the Arab Spring in Libya, when it was exactly 1 million crossed from Libya into Tunisia through the borders. And in 72 hours, UNHCR had deployed just a basic team who start to work around what do we need and start to find enough office space, make sure that the borders are were open, contact with the local actors, with the rebels that were controlling the borders and all these things. So during 6 months, we continue in an emergency mode. People arrive, they are on mission, they come, they go, we set things. And after 6 months, we became an operation with staff, with a specific funding, and with everything that you need. And then we start to work with a more calm way. So when I wanted my boss to let me go to Syria, the countries around Syria, we were already in the operational mode, but very close to the emergency mode. And that's one of the huge problems. What happens in an emergency is that the information gets old in an hour, mean, what was important and relevant 1 hour ago is no longer important and relevant. Where you have seen refugees, they are no longer there, they have moved. What was a border pass that was closed, no, it's open, or it's closed again, or all this. Information gets very, very, very quick old, but still it is very important to keep. After this, we are in a more calm way and we can work in a better way. One of the answers I gave, which was not about the bar, but it was to the High Commissioner, was in around this time, the High Commissioner, I had I had a problem with our IT department, a really serious problem. We have very different opinions, and as you can, I'm very passionate about what I'm doing, and I was defending my position very strong against the whole IT department. So the noise was so big that it went up to the High Commissioner of UNHCR, and he ended up in a meeting looking at me and saying, "Hey, Montserrat, what happens with the archives?" So I thought, here it is. I have 1 minute to convince the UNHCR principal, the High Commissioner that is listening to me, archivist, and now I have to convince him, who has never visited me, how important are archives. So what I thought, what are telling this man? You have 1 minute to convince him, 1 minute. So think hard and go, because you don't have time to prepare. So what I told to him, and he understood very well, in fact, is, Mr. High Commissioner, when an emergency is over, when the refugees are back, or they have been resettled, when they have found a solution, and we leave the country, I told him, I said, the only thing that is left, it is what I'm keeping in the archives. I'm your archivist, and I'm keeping the work we do. If it disappears, nothing will be remembered about what we did. And I said, and with paper, it's difficult to get, but easy to keep. But with information, which is in digital form, it's very easy to capture, very difficult to keep. So that's set out. That's why you have an issue with the IT. I said, yes, because they are not giving me what I need. And if you want me to protect your information and your legacy, you need to give me what I need. Well, that was my first answer. It is, I'm keeping the legacy of everything we have done since we were created. I'm keeping your work. And that's what I do, because you do a lot of things, but we keep history. And we have made this our motto in the archives. You make history, but we, the archives, keep it. No. So let's go back to the archives, now that we know what we do and we know how I convinced the High Commissioner that archives are important for him. It is what is in the archives, what it is there, and what it is about people. So the first thing, half of the archives, and even more, it's about refugees and their stories. What is the format we have it? Usually it's individual case files. So we register somebody and we get all the information about them, about their family, about their religion, about their persecution, about why they had to leave the country. All this is recorded in millions of stories since 1951, one after the other, in files and in databases. They are the stories. They are the stories of the victims of history. They are stories of the people who are not making history. It's the people who are suffering history. And we have them, and we have them about all the war, around the world. That's a unique one by one. This. And so we have the registration, we have how they make their case for being recognized as refugees. We have all the help they had during this period of their lives, that they are not under the protection of any state. And then many of them, if they are resettled, then what is the case we make for being them resettled? That's all this we have. And why will this be important? I mean, once they are no longer refugees, who cares about this? You may say, Why keeping millions and millions of files? And if they are no longer refugees, why should keep them? I will tell you some of the reasons. And the first one is because you never know when the refugee will meet the proof of the situation. So this is a very practical reason. We have sometimes grandchildren of refugees who can use the status of refugee to recuperate. 1 second. Sorry, I'm not alone. The door was open and somebody has entered. So so there's the practical reason that they may need to prove the refugee status. But there's not only this, and that's why I tell you a story, which really touched me a lot. So in the 19th, and maybe there is somebody who was a descendant of, after the end of the Vietnamese, the Vietnam War and the Indochina crisis was over, there was millions of people who were just on boats and they were rescued on the boats. And in all the region, many of them ended in the States. But many of them were rescued. And we were sometimes, from time to time, we have somebody who was a refugee, was a child refugee, or who was a descendant of refugee trying to find some information about this case. So one of them was a gentleman who, in the States, who contacted us because he was looking at the proof that he had left Vietnam. He was an adult. He had organized a vote to leave the country, and then he finally was rescued. He was moved to Singapore, and from Singapore he was resettled in the States. So he asked if we had anything about this, and in the archives we found the stats of the votes that we collected that day, but we also found a report of the boat, what happens to the boat that was attacked by pirates, that was four ships that passed, didn't rescue them until a Danish captain took them into the boat when they were sent to Singapore, and what happened with the boat, everything was there. And when he saw this, he told us this was like being a birth certificate again, because he knew this, but it was only in his head. And the fact that he had documents in front of him that were protected by us, explaining and proving that his memories were not only memories, they exist in a paper, this time in a paper, was giving him this sense of it existed and my story was real. I didn't make it up, but it happened. And I think that in these times of fake news and people wanting to change the history, this is an important thing to happen. And that, I know probably you know these Malcolm hierarchy needs. Those are psychologists talk about the needs we have. So if I talk about the food bar, you are in the physical needs, the basic needs. And UNHCR, when there is an emergency, what UNHCR does, it's the bottom of this pyramid. People needs food, needs water, needs security, needs clothing, needs to be safe, needs health. And then the second level is when we are above the emergency, and people, we need safety and security, and this is what refugee protection gives them. But above this, that's when it comes. We also need love. We also need the feeling that we have a family, we have friends, we have a connection. And this third is what refugees also have lost. They have lost all their reference around them. All this is lost. And this affects up. It affects their self-esteem. It affects their life, what they're going to do with this life. So keeping their stories, making them real, keeping for them and keeping them safe, because they are safe. They are not shared with who doesn't have the right to see them. It is contributing to this also protection of refugees. It's also protection of their identities. I like to say, well, maybe we don't save directly life, which we do sometimes. But what we save, it's communities, we save memories, and we save the sense of belonging, and we save identities and who people is. That's one of my answers to my boss about the food bar. And but I have more answers. There are more answers. I don't know if you, probably none of you was born at that time, but in the 60s in Nigeria, there was a civil war where the Biafra region tried to break from Nigeria. And this created a huge humanitarian crisis, and all these pictures, I remember them, were when I was a kid, of children starving, were circulating, and there was a movement, very informal, to get all these children out of Nigeria and in the countries, to just to make sure that they were kept. After years, all these children had to return home. And organizations were mainly they were mainly churches that were there, asked UNHCR for help to return the children. So UNHCR had experience returning children, organized that all these children return to their countries and to their families, and that the families was found and the child was returned. 50 years after this event, a German journalist contacted UNHCR because he said that somebody has wrote that UNHCR didn't return all the children, that there was around 1,000 children who were left behind because they didn't have paper. And he said, is UNHCR feeling proud of this, leaving behind children because of the lack of paper? So when he asked this, the journalist at UNHCR Contact Archive said, can you find out what happened 50 years ago about this? And what we found, it was the statistics, we find the correspondence, find everything, and we could prove that that's not what happened. UNHCR, all the children returned except some children who passed away, and that's children who were abroad studying, so they didn't want to return. But for the rest, they were all returned. They were all returned. So that's the second reason why UNHCR keep archives, because we need to protect our reputation. Sometimes we need to prove we didn't do things well. We have an accountability about our work. Sometimes we need to find our rights, why we are in a country, why we are expelled, and why we have a refugee camp there, we have the right to be there. Those are the most of the basic uses of an archives. And in fact, UNHCR was with refugees, and it can be as dramatic of defending our reputation that we did our work perfectly well. But I will say that this is not so different from any other archives in the world. You exist because the organization needs to prove how things were done. That's second answer, why UNHCR also needs to spend some money in its archives and not in food, because if we don't have reputation and if we don't can prove our work, then we will not be able to operate and we will disappear as an organization. But there is a third reason why UNHCR has to put some interest and keep its archives. And what you can see here, it's because if you probably know this idea that history is written by the winner and the victims are forgotten. It depends on which side of the confrontation you have in, that the story will be written in a way and will be written in another way. And now, but you see this child, this is 1956, Hungary, crisis in Hungary. Lots of Hungarians had to leave the country because the Russians were crashing a revolution, and they were refugees in Austria, in Yugoslavia, in many other places in the world. So at this time, European refugees receive a donation from Ethiopia. So who will think today that we all think in our short memories that it's always Europe helping Africa? But no, in 1956, an African country was helping a country like Hungary, who just seems to have forgotten all these things that they were in need of help years ago, and that their nationals were helped by who know are provoking, are creating refugees. Oh. The archives are not written histories. The archives keep the facts as we knew they happened when we were there. So if you are reading the correspondence, you will read it in the way it was written as it was happening. It is not the history of the past. The archives are not about the past. They are about people in the present, explaining the present. But when we go to the archives, we can go back to what the people who was living through a crisis, this is what they knew. This is why they took the decisions. This is what they felt. This is what it was. And there's not a story we are making. Historians will make a history. People will use these facts and will start the history. But the facts as they were, they are the ones that we keep in the archives and we don't touch them. So generation after generation after generation, they can go back and challenge our ideas, challenge what we think is true, challenge our assumptions, and look at ourselves like a mirror, saying, this is what it was 50, 40, 30, 100 years ago, how things really were and what people at that time knew. So if the history is written by the winners, the archives kept the path and the voices of the losers, of the victims, of the people who didn't have the big voice to be listened at, but we keep their stories. So that's why I'm so passionate about my work, is because it's the sense of, if we don't do it, who will do it? Who will keep this? And who will remember it? And what will happen with our origins and with humanity if we just forget everything, or we let it in the hands of people who want to change the history as it was? But there's another reason. Just I have been talking about why for me archives are so important, why I'm so passionate, how I convince UNHCR that we should invest also in the archives, because why they are important. But there's also a reason, and this is more personal, and I will show you here. So what this is today. I have a colleague, and she's preparing a training for a project, a European project we are involved with. And she had to explain what archives are. And she said, oh, there's a problem in English. You say archives to the document, and you say archives to the institution that keeps the document. It's very confusing. So she said, hey, colleagues, how do you say it in your languages? So all of us start to send her, on our languages. And this is what she got. So English was the origin, but as you can say, on a team of 20 people, and they are not all, some of us, so we have a Mongolian who couldn't find the alphabet, but this is how we said the same thing. So I'm going to consult the archives in the UNHCR archives. We all write in all these different countries and all these different languages. And that's one of the things I learned when I moved from my very nice small archives in a very nice European country, and I moved to UNHCR, and in a multilateral country with many, many different people. And what the things I learned is that the diversity is not a problem you need to solve. That diversity is the best way to work with so diverse people, is when you get the best diverse ideas, and what is you get the best solution for everything. Sometimes we need to discuss a lot because we don't understand each other, because we use different vocabularies, but the fact that we are so diverse as a team, it makes us very rich and very efficient and very convincing and very good. And I will go to the last one. I don't know if I'm very short or very taking the time. And I started with a picture of myself in Europe, but this is the zoom out, and you can see the team is in black. We are more people, but that's the people who are here. And behind what you have is, oops, former colleagues and senior people in the archives celebrating the International Archives Day. And we were celebrating and presenting. There's the High Commissioner there. There's this idea that they make history, they work in the operations, and we, the archivists, we are the ones who keep it, and we return it to them, return it to refugees, we return it to the world. And as my conclusion of this speech is, when I moved to UNHCR, I'm talking about 2000, I was sent to, like my colleague, which his story I have told you, my first mission was to Eritrea. The time Eritrea has, it was a new country, and they asked for help to rebuild their heritage, and the World Bank asked UNHCR if we could share them an archivist in the mission, so I went with them. So I was in Eritrea 2000, and to work with the Eritreans to build a national archive system. And that's not the picture. this is Afghanistan. But when I was there, Ethiopia invades Eritrea. They had a dispute and there was a war. And I was there. I have never, it was my first mission. It was my first time in Africa. It was my first mission with the UN, and all of a sudden I'm in the middle of a war. So after a week, I was evacuated. I was sent back to Geneva. And the thing I remember very strongly is that what it was normal, it was not Geneva with its with everybody safe. That was most of the war was what I left behind in Eritrea. That was where the majority of the humanity was living. That was what they were living. And I had this feeling that I have broken, that I have been living in a bubble, and well, this bubble has disappeared. I know was part connected with the war, and I had this strong feeling of connection, and that the fact that everything we do has an impact in everybody's life, not only in my western corner of the world, but it has a huge impact, the war. And that's my conclusion for today. So I hope I have replied to the question. I hope I have passed to you the importance and what a privilege it is to work in an organization where you feel that your job it's aligned with the values of the organization, and it contributes to improve the life of people and to make it a safer world. And that's my end. And then from here, I would like to hear from you, and if you have any question. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing.
So you didn't hear it, Montserrat, but there was applause for you. So we can open this now for questions from people in person as well as watching online through the Q&A chat function in the webinar. If you're in person, make sure that you can come up a little closer to our box up here to ask questions. Okay, we have a question. She's coming. She's making her way. De hecho, ella también habla español, pero.
What is it?
You can do it from there unless you want to be. We can see you actually, yeah.
So thank you.
See you.
Thank you. Thank you for all your work. Thank you for sharing this with our students. I think that the question that I have is referring to I don't know, you know, the camp, how do you open the camps? I guess is that easier as like, hey, hello, here we are, and here we put the camp. What is the procedure behind it? I think that could inform us a little bit. Thank you.
Okay, so usually when the emergency starts, you can imagine there's not a proper camp. So the camps are open where we can. Usually it's close to the border, and they are quite informal. As we can settle a little bit, the first thing is to find the land, and the best and as far away as possible from the border, because it's very dangerous. So we need to negotiate with whoever is the authority in the area we were to find land. Sometimes we have to buy the land or have to rent the land, or the government buys the land, and that's what you start. And we had to have a basic, we already have procedures. There is a department who has procedures, so they are engineers that have to settle for sanitation, where we're going to put that sanitation, we're going to put kitchens, where we're going to get energy from. Water points are very important, energy points are very important. Then how we're going to build, what it's going to be. So usually very at the beginning, the camp, it's whatever, even a plastic sheet makes it. And as the camp gets more settled, then it can have even proper houses. As I said, we try to have as little camps as possible, because a camp situation, it is refugees that are there suspended. I mean, they are not in the community, and they depend on help to survive. That's not a situation you want to be for a long time. Sometimes you can do whatever it is. But a camp is like a city, but it's a city that it's built very quick and it can disappear very quick. Had a colleague who saw how there's a huge camp in Tanzania, and he said after 30 years, all of a sudden, everything was gone. So there was no memory that they having a camp there, that thousands of people left there. It just was nothing. It has disappeared. It's a city that appears very quick and disappears very quick. And it depends a lot on the country, how much people can move around, if they can live or they cannot live, and how much security is. Yeah. We had a researcher from New York, and she was researching exactly how, she said, from chaos, you can create beauty. And she was looking at how the structure of the camps were created and how they improve and all these things. It was a very interesting, surprising research, how from chaos you can create beauty.
Hi there. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm curious, how could someone access your archives?
Okay.
If they can.
They can. Our archives are open when 20 years old. And that's a decision that in general, the UN system has this decision that archives are open when 20 years old, with exceptions. One of the big exceptions are the files of refugees, because refugees are alive, they are persecuted people, and it's their personal life. So in principle, those are only open when we can assume that the refugee and everybody who's in this file has passed away. In refugee units are very new, it's very few files that are open. You can get data, but not access to this. But for the rest, when 20 years old, the archives are open. So how do you do it? So in UNHCR site, you have history, and there is the link to the archives. There we have an online catalog where everything that is being processed, it's published. And from there, you can select the files you want and contact us. Yeah? Until now, you had to come to UNHCR, to a reading room, and we open it. COVID, we had to close. So we start to offer digitization on demand, and then no, we just open our reading room again. So we have, you can come, have access to the files you want, or you can ask for a digitized, but then it will be 10 files that we can send to you. But essentially you need to search what you want, tell us what you want, and then take an appointment with us to do it. Before we open a file, we need to review document by document, to make sure we are not disclosing information on refugees. That's the only thing we remove, and very exceptionally remove something else. But they are open and they are there for you, and you are welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am, you'll have to come up so we can hear you. Or at least a little closer.
I have a question. Would you be able to explain like the difference between a refugee and an asylee?
Yes, it was not clear. So an asylum seeker is somebody who has crossed the border and has presented itself to the authorities or to UNHCR saying, I am persecuted in my country. At this moment, you are protected. You cannot be returned to your country until your case is here. So you make your case, and then there is a series of interviews where to state, are you really a refugee or you are not really a refugee? Are you protected by the international law or by the country law on your refugee status or no? If you are recognized as a refugee, this is called the refugee status determination. If you are recognized as a refugee, then you become a refugee. But if you are not recognized, then you are no longer protected. You have the right to appeal, but if you are not recognized as a refugee, then you are not protected by the international law, and the country can send you back. So that's it's the time you are between you say across the border I'm a refugee, and it is that, and an authority says yes, you are a refugee, and you are recognized as a refugee. When there is an emergency, there is no something like this. So when Libyans crossed 1 million in few days, they were all declared what is called prima facie. I mean, if you are coming from Libya or no, you are coming from Syria, you are recognized as a refugee. If you are coming from a country that it's an emergency situation, you are a Rohingya, you only, because you are a Rohingya, because you are a refugee without any determination, and you are not asylum seeker. You are a refugee. It's direct.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Any other questions? Montserrat, how many languages do you actually speak?
I speak 4.5. So I speak, my mother language is Catalan. I speak Spanish because I learned in the school. I speak English because, as you can see, I'm speaking a kind of English. I speak French, which I learned also in the school, but then in Geneva I had to practice, and now I'm fourlingual, we can say. I'm learning Italian, and I understand very well Italian, but I mix it with all the other Latin languages I'm talking at this. But yeah, so 4.5, I can say. I understand Portuguese, and but not German. That I don't understand German. No. Which is quite usual and with colleagues. So all the colleagues you saw there, we all speak at least 2 languages. And when I get monolinguals, usually English speakers, I say, well, you have to learn French because many of our colleagues speak French. So when they complain, said it's difficult for you to learn French as it was for us to learn English. So that's to put people in an empathy situation to understand us. No, no non-speakers. No. Yeah, but I was saying 4. Yeah.
Hello.
Hi. Hello.
Would you say that the archives that the refugees create, does that add to the Maslow hierarchy of needs? Do you think that fulfills some of the needs that you said that when you mentioned the Maslow hierarchy of needs, you think the archives fulfill some of those needs?
let me see if I understand the question. So you're asking about this pyramid I show and the different needs? Yes. And if archives are in the bottom, are you asking, or they are in? Yeah.
Do you think
Yeah.
that?
Well, they are in the. I mean, the moment a file save alive, it is in the bottom because this is your safety. You exist. So it is usually the files that save live are still active. So we don't have all of them, but we have some of them. Because, for instance, in Syria, there were many Iraqis refugees, and when the war started, and when the war started, the Iraqis who were safe in Syria had to leave. So all the files that were in the archives became open again. And to be sure that they were not refull and resent to danger, and then we had to very quickly return them. So usually when we have a request from this, we just, it's the first thing, everything is dropped and we find the file for them. These will be the cases where it's life-saving. In other cases, it's more indirect because we train colleagues how to protect information in their active files. We train them how you have to make sure that nobody enters, that the information is not leaked, that you have put safety and protection around the files. So this is again very close to this. Then the rest, I would say, we go to second, third, and up. Yeah. Welcome.
Hello. So
Hi.
I'm wondering, as far as your job as an archivist, when it comes to more historic historic events, how far does your job go into recovering information that maybe wasn't gathered in a situation that was maybe earlier or before your job was more specialized into making sure every detail was gathered and recorded?
Mm-hmm. So the archives, just starting the archives, and UNHCR was created in 1950 and started to operate in 1951. The archives were created in 1996, so there is a huge gap, but there was nobody taking care. UNHCR had its own way to manage, so we have to take all this. So the first thing we do is, with all the archives that we receive now, or that we have received from the past, is to make sure that we know them and they are protected. And we do a very high level inventory to know, just to tell. We have archives about Rohingyas from 1970. And we start to describe them with metadata, and at least at the file level, and explaining what is this, what we have here, and how much, what you will find. We don't usually go more than this. So we describe, but we don't do the work of a researcher, except for UNHCR colleagues. So if somebody in Myanmar asks us what happened, why we have this camp, what we did in the 80s that didn't work, then we do a little bit more. We try to find information, we try to package it for them, and we send them, but not for externals. For externals, they have to come and do their own research. And since we have huge archives and not enough team, we stop essentially at the file level. So it is the file, then we have to go inside to look at it. Just will put an example. When we received these files, I talked about the Yugoslavia, talking about 10,000 files in a war situation that were created with people rotating all the time. As you can imagine, when they were in Yugoslavia, they had other things that think about the archives. So when they were sent to us, it was total mess. We had a team of 5 archivists working for a year. And what they did first is, what is this? How many countries we were in? How many offices we had? They start with this. Once they knew this, they could start to separate them by offices and to reconstruct as much as possible the way they were created. And then describe them at the file level. We are about to publish all this information, which will be open to very soon to the archivists. But here was we stop. The work of archivist is always to preserve the original order, how it was created, and not to change it as much as you can. Sometimes it's the original disorder, and then that's when we have to go a little bit further. But that's it. Yeah.
All right, thank you. I also want to ask,
yes,
like in your position, how important do you find that archive work is for informing new policy decisions as far as, you know, addressing new kind of up and coming issues?
well, an example, UNHCR has decentralized, we have been regionalized, and before they regionalized, so we used to be all in headquarters, used to be all in Geneva, and now the regional bureaus are in the regions. So before they did this, the group who was doing the research, they asked for all the previous decentralizations UNHCR had done, the previous worst, and they study it to understand how we did it in the past. And I told them, look, I have many files about regionalizing, and there's never files about recentralizing, but somehow we recentralize again. So make sure this time you do it better. Or they do this all to find background. That is not always the case. I mean, because UNHCR, it's emergency situation, it has a culture of I arrive, I find my way, I take my decisions, I solve the problem, I save life, and then I move to the next operation and I forget. So the culture of going back to the archive is not very well established, and it's something archives is creating. No, first existing, second being efficient to reply to questions, and then showing that it is much more better if you do a research before. But we do most of our clients are internal, and it could be any type of request, anything you can imagine that they are looking for. And usually I'm very proud to say that usually we find something that is useful for them.
All right, thank you.
Welcome.
So Montserrat, can you see the chat question or not?
Let me see the chat question. Ah, I see it is a chat question. Well, she's asking me.
Hold on, let me explain the question to the audience.
Okay, okay.
Sorry. So she's asking how conserving humanity's memory, which is a big responsibility, but how does that impact her as a writer? Like, what's the connection between her professional life and her her job as a writer, particularly for children's literature?
Yeah, the first impact of moving to UNHCR, because I wrote and everything I published was before I moved to UNHCR. So the first impact was I stopped writing, publishing, not writing, I stopped publishing, because I was so absorbed by the work, and also I was cut from my language. So I was not working anymore with Catalan people or Catalan writers. So I got very disappear. So, but what I have done is use a lot my skills as a writer and as a storyteller to, as you can see today, you have been through this. I told many stories. So even when I write the most boring report, I always tell a story. So I use the writing to help me with my work. And there's many stories that had come to my mind I would like to write from the archives, many, because it's just so amazing what you read, and it may sound strange, but it makes me optimistic, because I see in all these 70 years how many countries have been through very difficult situations, and then they find and they stabilize and they find a way and there were solutions. I see how many refugees who had very difficult stories, they settle and then they became very important people in their countries and their communities. So it affects me, making me positive. Writing anything about what I have in the archives, I haven't done it. It's a kind of professional thing that I don't do. I don't mix the stories I'm reading in UNHCR and the stories I'm writing as a children, not directly, huh? But it's more behind. But everything I do affects my writing, which is happening. Everything I observe, everything I learn, and the fact to have access to this worldwide experience and the fact of working with people from all around the world is affecting me the way I see the world and of course the way I write. No, with much an open mind. Well, welcome. De nada.
For your presentation. I just had a question. How easy, or I would say difficult, is it for you to obtain archives from countries who historically have tried to hide their nation's history, like for example, China, or Cuba? Like how difficult or hard is it to get those archives?
No, the archives we keep, they are our archives. So UNHCR archives is the ones we create. We are in the country and we create our files and we keep them. What's interesting, so we are not keeping the archives of created by China, Uyghurs, for instance, but we keep the ones we create. So we will have the refugees who tell us stories, which China will deny, for instance, or whatever country who doesn't want to take responsibility, but we have the story. That's why we keep them, because we have collect them in our work, and that's why we keep them. And we are there. I mean, one of the extraordinary things about UNHCR and my colleagues is that when there's an emergency, they send a report every day. Every day they write what is happening, what they have seen, and it's firsthand. They're there. So they may be talking with the refugee, they may be discussing with the government, they may be discussing with the perpetrator, but they have to deal with them. They may be telling that what you are doing is not correct. And all this is in these reports. They are called protection reports, and they are extreme situation reports, and they're extremely rich. So it's just a couple of examples of the fact that even if it's only your archives, how important they are. One is Brazil. You know, Brazil had a dictatorship years ago, and Latin America had many dictators. UNHCR was there, and essentially we were trying to help refugees in different countries to leave Latin America or to move them from one country to another. Chile had many refugees. When there was the coup d'etat in Chile, they had to leave. It was a very complex situation. And let's see, some years ago, we had a researcher from Brazil, and looking at all these reports, he could see the pattern of how the different dictatorships were helping each other. And nobody in UNHCR was doing this. We are not there as observers of what we are, just helping people. But only from the hints and only in the information we're writing, he got, and it was for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that he did this. He could see it from this. And I had another interesting case, and I have an Armenian colleague from the diaspora, and we had a Turkish researcher, and the colleague who was preparing the files said, "What I do?" I said, "You do nothing." Everybody comes and everybody has the right to see the files. We are not writing, everybody will take their conclusions as far as they don't falsify the records. They have, it was not an archivist who asked this question. Archivist who will have never asked this question, but it was a kind of shocking for me that somebody could think that we should do something. No, the archives are open to everybody. We are not, we don't ask, not even you are a researcher. Everybody has the right to come and use them like this. But it's interesting, is being an international organization, we have a different story because we are not affected by the country interest. So we are not neutral, but we are more neutral than them. So it's a very good complement of national history.
Thank you.
We're about at time. If there's another question, anyone? No? Montserrat, thank you very much for your presentation today. And I will see you actually tomorrow in another
Yes.
Spanish. So thank you very much. And thank you to the library for hosting this and for the archive speaker series also. So thank you.
Thank you for coming. Thank you to all of you.